The third winter of her service, on the morning the great hall filled with the parish poor, Prudence Faircloth was turned out of Cromarsh Abbey with a small bundle and a single accusation ringing behind her. She stood at the foot of the kitchen stairs in the grey light, her apron still tied, flour to the wrist, while the housekeeper read the words from a folded paper, and would not meet her eyes. A thief, that was the word. The cook was a thief, and the cook would be gone before the noon bell, and no character would follow her to any door in the county. Behind the housekeeper, in the doorway that led up to the lighted rooms, the Duchess of Cromarsh watched, with her gloved hands folded at her waist and her chin lifted, and she did not say the word herself. She had no need. She had set it loose and let it walk down the stairs on another woman's tongue. Prudence did not weep. She had learned in 3 winters below those stairs that weeping was a thing the house took from you and used. She looked at the Duchess across the cold flags, and the Duchess looked back at her with the steady, untroubled certainty of a woman who had never once been contradicted by anyone whose contradiction could reach her. Then Prudence bent and lifted her bundle, and felt against her ribs through the cloth the hard square corner of the little book she had sewn into the lining the night before, the book the Duchess wanted. The book the Duchess did not know still existed. What the Duchess did not yet know was that she had just dismissed the only person in England who could prove what she had done. Let me carry you back, before the word thief was ever spoken, to the autumn 3 years gone, when Prudence first came down the Dunsworth Road to a house she had been told was generous. She had been a widow 9 months, then 26 years old, the daughter of a Bristol victualler, who had taught her to read a ledger before she could plait her own hair. Her husband had been a ship's purser, a careful man with figures, drowned off Cadiz when his vessel went down with all her stores unaccounted for, and the Navy had paid Prudence nothing because the Navy could not say where its biscuit had gone. So she had taken the only trade a careful, literate woman could take, that did not require a fortune to begin it. She had gone into service as a cook, and the place that took her was Cromarsh Abbey, a great grey pile of a house above the river, and the steward who hired her, a smooth man named Tranter, had told her the family was known through the whole county for its charity. That part at least had once been true. The old Duke had died the spring before Prudence came, and he had left behind him a thing the village still spoke of with bared heads, the Almsbury Bread Charity. A trust, founded by his grandfather and renewed by his own hand, that every quarter day fed and clothed the poor of the parish from a fund the family held in keeping. 6 almswomen lived in the row of stone cottages below the church wall on the charity's coin. 40 families took bread at the abbey door each quarter. The fund was real money, kept in a deed box with 3 keys, and the late Duke had bound it in law so that no single hand could spend it alone. 2 trustees were named to it. One was the Duke himself, and after him whoever held Cromarsh. The other was a neighbor, a younger man of rank, whom the old Duke had trusted above his own blood, the Duke of Marenby, whose seat at Edrington lay 4 miles east across the water meadows. Prudence learned all of this in her first month because the keeping of the charity touched the kitchen. The quarter-day bread was baked in her ovens, the almswomen's broth came from her coppers, and the accounts of what the charity spent were copied, in those first months, by an old man named Calbeck, who had been almoner to the abbey for 40 years, and whose hand had grown too unsteady to keep a clean column. He would sit by her fire of an evening, his spectacles down his nose, and dictate the figures while she wrote them fair into the great account book, because the Duchess had decided that a cook who could write a tidy column was cheaper than a clerk from Dunsworth. So it was Prudence's hand, in the end, that copied the true accounts of the Almsbury Bread Charity, for 2 full years. Every quarter, every shilling in and every shilling out, written fair into the great ledger. And then, because old Calbeck taught her to, and because her dead husband had taught her never to trust a single book, copied again, smaller, into a receipt book of her own that she kept in the kitchen drawer beneath the spice papers. A purser's habit. Keep your own tally, trust the house's book. Only as far as you can check it against your own. She had not known when she began the habit, that it would one day be the only honest column left in the county. The Duchess was the late Duke's widow, Veronica, Duchess of Cromarsh. She had been a beauty of a famous season 20 years before and had married the title rather than the man, and the man had been 30 years her senior and had left her. When he died, a great house, a small jointure, and no power at all over the one thing in his estate she most wished to touch: the charity. Because the trust required 2 hands, and because the second hand belonged to the Duke of Marrenby, who was at sea, the fund had sat untouched and untouchable through the first year of her widowhood, fat and locked, while the Duchess sat above it, with her gaming debts climbing like ivy up a wall. Prudence saw the debts before she understood them. She saw the tradesmen turn from the door with promises. She saw the Duchess's diamonds go to Dunsworth in a velvet roll one week and come back the next, lighter by a stone, the empty claw filled with paste. She saw the steward Tranter grow quiet and watchful, and she saw the charity's great book begin, in the 3rd year, to lie. It began as a single altered line. The almswomen's quarterly coal entered at the true figure in Prudence's own receipt book, written into the charity's ledger at twice the sum, the difference vanishing into a column marked only with Tranter's initials. Then it was the bread flour. Then it was a whole disbursement to the Dunsworth surgeon for the almswomen's winter physic, a sum of £19, entered as paid and never paid at all, so that old widow Sallow died of a chest that £19 of physic might have eased, and the £19 went, Prudence was nearly certain, to a gaming table in Bath. The Duchess had found her second key. Not Marrenby's hand, but the next best thing. But a steward who would forge the Duke's trust into her private purse, and a great ledger that no living soul but a kitchen cook would ever think to read against the truth. This is the part of the story I most want you to hold close, because everything that comes after turns upon it. The proof of the Duchess's crime was never hidden in a strong room or a lawyer's chest. It was a child's habit kept by a careful woman. A small book beneath the spice papers, written in a cook's plain hand, against which the great forged ledger could be laid line by line until the lie stood up and named itself. The Duchess did not know that book existed. Not yet. She thought the only danger was the forged ledger, which Tranter controlled, and the old almoner Calbec, who was failing, and the locked deed box, whose 3rd key she did not hold. She had counted her dangers. She had simply counted one short. The Duke of Marrenby came home from the sea in the October of that 3rd year. Prudence first saw him on a wet afternoon, when he rode into the Abbey Court unannounced, and stood dripping in the great hall, asking for the books of the charity he had been named to keep. She watched him from the screen passage, a tall man in a plain dark riding coat, rain running off the high collar. His face still as ice over a river. His jaw was hard and set, his hair black and cropped close in the naval fashion, his eyes the grey of weather coming in off the sea, and there was a stillness to him that the Abbey's people did not know how to answer. He asked for the accounts. The Duchess received him in the long drawing-room with every courtesy, and told him the late almoner's affairs were in disorder, that old Calbec's failing hand had muddled the columns, that she had set her steward to put all in order, and the books would be ready for his inspection by the new year. The Duke said, his voice level, that the new year would suit him, and he looked, for one moment, past the Duchess's shoulder, through the open door, down the passage to where a woman in a cook's apron stood with a copper jug in her hands and her eyes on his face. And then he looked away, and Prudence carried her jug down to the kitchen and told herself the look had meant nothing, because a duke did not look at a cook, and a cook did not let herself be looked at. The Duchess had seen the look too. The Duchess saw everything that might be turned to use or to danger, and a duke's grey eye resting half a breath too long on a kitchen woman was to a mind like hers a thing to be filed and remembered. He came again. That was the danger the Duchess had not foreseen in him, that he was a man who came again. Natatiri. He came on charity business, properly, as a trustee had every right to do. And each time he came, he asked one more question than the Duchess wished to answer. And each time he was turned with the same smooth promise of books not yet in order. A house is not the drawing room only. A house is also its yard and its still room and its bakehouse, and a trustee, who means to see how a charity is truly run, will walk down into the bakehouse on a quarter morning and watch the bread go out. He walked down into Prudence's kitchen on the quarter morning before Christmas, and he found her at the long table counting loaves against a list, her lips moving over the figures, flour to her wrists, and he stood in the doorway and watched her count and did not interrupt until she had finished. Then he asked her how many families took the quarter bread. 40, she told him. She did not curtsy deeply enough, perhaps, but she answered him plain, because a plain question deserved a plain answer. 40 families. Your Grace and 6 almswomen besides. And the broth for the cottages goes out at noon. He asked her what the charity spent on the bread in a quarter. And Prudence, who had copied that figure with her own hand for 2 years and copied it twice, told him the true sum to the shilling, 11 pounds 4 shillings, for the flour and the firing and the carriage. And she watched his face change. It was a small change, no more than a tightening at the corner of the eye, the look of a man hearing a true figure where he had been given a false one, because the official ledger the Duchess had promised him said the bread cost the charity above 20 pounds a quarter, and here was a cook with flour on her wrists telling him without knowing she did it, that the difference of 9 pounds a quarter walked out of the fund each 3 months and went nowhere a poor man's mouth would ever taste it. He did not say so. He thanked her, his voice low, and he asked her name. Faircloth, she said. Mrs. Faircloth, the cook. He repeated it once, quietly, as if setting it somewhere he would find it again. And then he went back up the stairs to the lighted rooms, and Prudence stood at her table, with her heart going hard, and told herself again that it meant nothing. It did not mean nothing, it meant the Duchess had run out of winter. The dismissive word for Prudence in that house had always been a small one, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Pinchbeck, voiced it first in a private aside in the still room 3 days after the Duke's question about the bread. She found Prudence weighing sugar, and said not unkindly but very firmly that the cook would do well to keep below stairs where she belonged, that a kitchen woman who let a duke ask her his questions was a kitchen woman forgetting her place, and that the only thing that came of a cook reaching above her station was a cook turned out of doors, with no character. Know your place, Mrs. Bland. Faircloth, the housekeeper said, and she said it as a kindness, and Prudence heard the warning underneath it and weighed her sugar, and said nothing. The Duchess had heard the same news. The housekeeper had heard that the Duke had gone down into the kitchen and come up with a figure in his head, and the Duchess did not deal in kind warnings. The Duchess understood, with the cold clarity of a gambler who sees the table turning, that her danger was no longer old Calbeck's failing hand or the locked deed box. Her danger was the cook. The cook knew the true figures. The cook had said one of them aloud to the one man in the county with the legal right to act upon it. So the Duchess began to defend herself, and she defended herself well, because she was not a stupid woman, and a confidently wrong one is the most dangerous kind. First, she moved to control the proof she knew of. She had Tranter bring her the charity's account book, the forged thing itself, and she did not destroy it, because a trust with no accounts at all would itself raise the alarm. Instead, she had Tranter copy it fair, into a clean new volume, every false figure carried forward in a clerkly hand, the old book with its erasures and its altered lines burned in the steward's room one night, so that the only ledger Merrenby could ever inspect was the clean lie. The smell of burning leather came down the kitchen chimney that night, and Prudence, lying awake on her cot off the scullery, knew it for what it was, and pressed her hand to the little book beneath her pillow, and understood that the house had just destroyed its own evidence, and that hers was now the only true record the trust possessed. Second, the Duchess moved against the witness who could corroborate. Old Calbeck, the almoner, lived in the first of the almshouse cottages, the very charity he had once kept, and his memory, though his hand shook, was sound. He knew the true figures of 40 years. He could stand before Marenby and say the bread had never cost £20, that the surgeon's £19 had never been paid, that widow Sallow had died for the want of physic the book swore was bought. So the Duchess sent Tranter to the cottage with a quarter's coal and a quiet word. And the quiet word was that an old man's almshouse roof was held at the charity's pleasure, and the charity's pleasure was the Duchess's, and an old man who told tales to the Duke might find his pleasant cottage. Calbec was 80 years old and afraid of the cold. He took the coal and held his tongue, and when Prudence walked down with the almswomen's broth, she saw the new coal in his scuttle and the new fear in his face, and understood that the Duchess had bought her witness with a winter. Third, and most cleverly, the Duchess moved to destroy the credit of the cook, before the cook could ever be believed. This was the part of her defense Prudence did not see coming, because it was aimed at her, and a person seldom sees the blow aimed at the back of the head. The Duchess began in small ways to build a thief. A silver ladle went missing from the plate room and was found, a week later, at the bottom of the cook's own clothes press, where Tranter's hand had surely put it. A sum of housekeeping money came up short, and the shortfall was traced on the housekeeper's books to the kitchen accounts Prudence kept. None of it was true. All of it was written down, witnessed, made to look like a pattern, so that when the day came to turn the cook out of doors, it would seem the just and natural end of a long suspicion, and any tale the disgraced cook afterward told of forged charity ledgers would be heard as the spite of a woman caught stealing spoons. The Duchess prepared her ground like a general. She made certain that when she finally struck, the cook would fall, not as an honest woman wronged, but as a thief unmasked, and that no magistrate, no parson, no trustee in England would take the word of such a woman against the word of a duchess. It was a good plan. It was very nearly a perfect plan. It failed for one reason only, and the reason was this. The Duchess had built her thief out of objects, a ladle, a coin, a column of housekeeping figures, and she had never once imagined that the cook had been building something too quietly for 2 years, out of the only material a careful woman in a kitchen ever has. The truth, copied small and kept. The week before Christmas, the Duke sent word that he would come on the quarter day itself, the 12th night feast, to take his inspection of the charity at last, and to dine in the great hall while the parish poor were fed at the abbey door, as the old Duke had always done. He named the day. He would not be put off again. The Duchess, reading his letter, understood that her winter of delay was over, and that the cook must be gone before that day came, gone and disgraced, so that if Marenby's eye sought her down the passage again, he would find only an empty kitchen and a sad story of a thieving servant turned away. She struck on the morning of the 11th of January, the day before the feast. Prudence had risen at 4 to set the great ovens for the quarter bread. She was at the long table, the 40 loaves rising under their cloths, the coppers steaming for the almswomen's broth, when Mrs. Yast Pinchbeck came down the stairs with the folded paper in her hand, and the Duchess behind her in the doorway, and read out, in a voice that shook only a little, that the cook was dismissed for theft, that she would take nothing from the house, that she would be gone before the noon bell, and that no character would be given. The silver ladle was named. The short housekeeping money was named. It was all there, written and witnessed. A thief unmasked at last. And there the Duchess made the one true mistake of her careful campaign. Standing in the doorway with her hands folded and her chin lifted, certain of her victory, she could not resist saying the second voicing of the small word, not the kind warning the housekeeper had given, but the cruel public version of it, said loud enough for the scullery maids to hear and carry through the house. She said that a woman who forgot her station ended as a thief at the kitchen door, and that this one had always been going to end here. Know your place. She said it as a verdict. She said it as though the whole long fall of the cook had been written from the first day, and the Duchess had only turned the final page. And the maids heard, and the word went up through the house. And by the noon bell every soul at Cromarsh believed the cook a thief. Prudence lifted her bundle. She felt the hard, square corner of the little book against her ribs through the lining, where she had sewn it the night before. The moment the smell of burning leather had told her the house meant to leave no honest book but hers. She had sewn it in by candlelight, the receipt book of 2 years, every true figure of the Almesbury bread charity in her own plain hand, and she carried it now out of the only door that had been open to her, past the Duchess, in the doorway, up the cold stairs, and out across the Abbey Court into the January morning. A thief in the eyes of all the world, and the only honest column left in the county sewn into her stays. She walked the Dunsworth Road in a thin wind, with nowhere to go. She did not walk it bravely. She walked it, frightened. A widow of 27, now turned off without a character, the word thief, walking the county faster than her own feet could carry her away from it. She had a little money sewn into her hem, and a cousin in Bristol who might or might not take her in, and a long cold road between. She did not at first think of the book she carried as a weapon. She thought of it only as the one true thing she owned, the proof that she at least knew she was honest. Even if no living soul would ever believe her, that was the truth of her dark hour. It was not that the path forward had closed. It was that she could not see the path at all, and she carried the very thing that would save her against her own heart, and felt only its weight. She had walked 2 miles when she came to the almshouse cottages below the church wall, and she stopped, because old Calbeck was at his door. He had heard. The whole row had heard. The almswomen stood in their doorways and would not look at her, because the charity that fed them was the Duchess's to give and to take. And a woman seen speaking kindly to a dismissed thief might find her own coal short next quarter. Old Calbeck stood at his door, though, and old Calbeck was 80, and afraid of the cold, and ashamed of his fear. And when Prudence passed, he said her name. Just her name. Mrs. Faircloth. And then in a voice the wind nearly took, the thing that broke the Duchess's careful ground apart. He said, his old voice low, that he was sorry that he should have spoken. I knew the figures were false, and I held my tongue for a scuttle of coal, he said, and now they have made a thief of the only one of us, with the courage to keep them true. It was the third voicing of the word, and it was the one that turned it, because it came not as a warning, and not as a verdict, but as a witness's confession, an old man naming aloud, before the almswomen of the row, that the cook was no thief, and that he himself had been bought to let the lie stand. Prudence stood in the cold, and looked at him and understood slowly, the way you understand a thing you have known a long time without letting yourself see it, that she was not the only one who knew, that there were 2 of them, a cook with a true book and an almoner with a true memory, and that one of them at least had nothing left to lose but a scuttle of coal and a few cold months, and would rather lose them clean than die having held his tongue. She did not go on to Bristol. She turned instead 4 miles east, across the frozen water meadows toward Edrington, where the Duke of Marranby kept his seat, and she walked the whole grey afternoon with the book against her ribs and the old man's confession warm in her chest, and she did not know, walking, whether a duke would so much as let a dismissed cook past his lodge gate. He let her past his gate. That was the first mercy. She came to Edrington at dusk, frozen to the bone, and gave her name at the door as Mrs. Faircloth, lately cook at Cromarsh, and asked to speak to his grace on a matter of the Almesbury bread charity, and was made to wait a long while in a cold stone passage, certain she would be turned away. The Duke came out himself. He found her standing there in her thin cloak, with the cold coming off her, a dismissed servant, a named thief, and the first thing he did before he asked her a single question was to tell a footman to bring her to the fire and something hot to drink. "Come inside," he said. His voice was level. It sounded to her frightened ear almost cold. She would learn in time that the coldness was the discipline a man wraps around, a thing he feels too strongly to show, but that night she only heard the command and obeyed it, and sat by his library fire shaking, and warmed her raw hands at the blaze. Then he asked her to tell him why she had come. Here the Duke of Merrenby's own heart must be opened for one moment, because the story turns on it. He had a wound, and the wound had a shape. Years before, newly come into his title, he had let his own sister fall into want after a bad marriage, meaning always to fund her keep and never finding the time. And she had died in the cold ward of a charity house in the north that better keeping might have warmed. He had carried ever since a fierce silent care for the small honest workings of such places, the bread and the coal and the physic, the unglamorous shillings that stood between a poor woman and a cold death. The old Duke of Cromarsh had known this of him, and had named him trustee for that reason. So when a frozen cook stood in his library and laid out, line by line from a small worn book, how the bread of the parish poor had been turned into a duchess's gaming coin, the Duke did not hear a servant's spite. He heard the exact sound of the thing he had spent his life unable to forgive himself for letting happen. He went very still and very cold, and his gray eyes did not leave her face, and Prudence, reading the stillness for displeasure, nearly stopped. She did not stop. She had walked 4 miles in the cold, and had nothing left to lose but the telling, so she told it whole. She laid the receipt book open on his library table in the candlelight, and she walked him through it as her dead husband had taught her to walk through a false account line against line. Here is the bread. £11 for the quarter true. In my hand copied as it was spent. Here is what the official ledger swears it cost, above £20. Here is the surgeon's £19 for Widow Sallow's physic, entered as paid. The physic was never bought. The widow died. Here is the almswomen's coal, doubled in the great book, the difference gone to a column with only the steward's initials against it. And the great book itself, Your Grace, the old one with the erasures, is burned. They burned it the week before they turned me out. The clean book, Tranter will show you, is a fair copy of the lie. The erasures all smoothed away. This is the only true column left. I kept it, because my husband taught me never to trust a single book, and I did not know, when I began, that I was keeping the only honest record of a stolen charity in the county. The Duke listened to all of it, without a word. When she had done, he asked her one question, and the question told her he had understood everything. He asked whether anyone living, besides herself, could swear the great ledger had been altered, and Prudence told him about old Cowbeck, the almoner of 40 years bought with a scuttle of coal to hold his tongue, who had broken that morning at his cottage door and confessed before the almswomen of the row that the figures were false, and that he had let the lie stand from fear. One witness with a true memory, she said, and one cook with a true book, and the burned ledger between us that no longer exists to say otherwise. The Duke was quiet a long moment. Then he said her given name for the first time. He had called her Mrs. Faircloth at the door, and Mrs. Faircloth by the fire, correct and distant, but now, with the book open between them in the candlelight and the whole shape of the crime laid bare, he said, low, almost to himself, her name. Prudence. Then you have done what no magistrate in this county managed to do, he said. You have kept the proof. And the saying of her name, the plain given name, no one in that great house had used in 3 winters, undid something in her that the cold and the word thief had not managed to undo, and she had to look down at the book to keep her face still. He did not declare himself. His own grief would not let him, and the discipline of his rank would not let him, and there was a charity to save before there was anything else to say. He crossed instead to the window and stood, with his back to her, his jaw like carved stone in the candle glow, and said level that she would not go to Bristol, that she would stay at Edrington under his housekeeper's care until the matter was settled, that no woman who had carried the truth 4 miles across the ice to put it in his hands would walk another step in the cold on his account. Eat something, he said, not turning. Sit by the fire. You are safe here. The commands were cold, and they were the kindest thing that had been said to her in 3 years, and Prudence sat by the fire and ate, and understood that she had walked out of one house a thief, and into another a witness, and did not yet dare to wonder what else she might be. The 12th night feast came, and with it, the reckoning. The Duke did not move against the Duchess by stealth, and this was the measure of him. He might have gone to a magistrate, quietly laid the book before the law, had her arrested in the dark. He did not. The old Duke had bound the charity to be administered in the open, before the parish, on the quarter day, and Nicholas chose to honor it in the open. He sent word to Cromarsh that he would come on the 12th night as arranged, to take his inspection and see the poor of the parish fed at the abbey door, and that as co-trustee he required the steward Tranter and the almoner Calbec, both present, and the charity's accounts laid upon the long table, for the trustees to examine together before the company. It was his right. It could not be refused, without raising the very alarm the Duchess had spent a winter avoiding. She could only dress and lay her table, and prepare to face him with her clean-forged book, and her bought witness and her absent thief, and trust that her ground would hold. Her ground did not hold, and it did not hold, because of the very arena she had chosen for her triumph. The great hall of Cromarsh on the 12th night was full, the parish poor at the lower door, waiting for their quarter bread, the county gentry at the high table, the almswomen brought up from the row in their best shawls, the Duchess at the head of her board in a gown the color of claret with the paste stone winking in her necklace where the diamond had been, her niece, Lady Margaret Rayton, seated near the Duke, placed there by the Duchess's own hand because the Duchess had long meant Marenby for the girl, and had thought even now, even amid her danger, that a marriage might mend all, and the steward Tranter at the side table with the clean ledger, the fair copy of the lie ready to be shown. The Duke took his seat as trustee. He called for the ledger. Tranter brought it, smooth and clerkly, and laid it open, and the Duchess watched the Duke turn the pages with the small, fixed smile of a woman certain her forgery would pass, because who in that hall could read a charity's accounts against the truth? The almoner was bought, the cook was gone, disgraced, a thief. There was no honest column left in the county to lay against her clean book. There was one. The Duke had it in his coat. He turned the pages of the clean ledger without haste. Then he set beside it on the long table, in the full sight of the high table and the gentry and the waiting poor, a small worn receipt book in a plain hand, and he said, his voice level and carrying the length of the hall, that he held in his other hand the true accounts of the Almsbury bread charity. Jacquet kept these 2 years by the only person in the house who had troubled to keep them honest, and that he would now read them, line against line, against the book the steward had laid before him, and let the company judge which book lied. The Duchess's smile did not fall at once. She was too practiced for that. She said smoothly that she did not know what scrap his grace had been given, but that the keeping of a great charity could hardly rest on the scribble of a kitchen servant, and a dismissed one at that. A woman put from the house not a week since for theft of the very plate she had served on. There it was, the third move of her defense played as she had always meant to play it, the thief's word against the Duchess's book. She had built the thief for exactly this moment. The Duke did not raise his voice. He read the bread. £11 the quarter in the small book, above 20 in the clean ledger, and asked Tranter to account for the difference, and Tranter could not. He read the surgeon's £19, entered as paid for Widow Sallow's winter physic, and he turned to the almswomen at the lower table and asked plainly whether the Widow Sallow had ever received her physic, and there was a silence. And then one of the old women said, in a voice like a dry leaf, that the Widow Sallow had died of her chest in December with no physic at all, and that they had all known it, and held their peace. He read the coal, doubled in the clean ledger, the difference gone to a column marked with the steward's own initials, and he asked Tranter whose hand had made those initials. And Tranter, grey to the lips, said nothing, which is its own kind of answer in a full hall. And then the Duchess made her last move, the one that ended her. Because a confidently wrong person cannot believe, even at the edge, that their script has stopped working. She turned to old Calbec, seated below the salt in his best shawl, and she said, with all the weight of the charity's roof in her voice, that surely the almoner of 40 years would tell. His Grace the official ledger was sound, that the kitchen woman's scribble was the muddle of an ignorant servant. She commanded his lie in front of the parish, certain that the coal she had bought him with would hold. The coal did not hold. The old man rose. He was 80 and his hand shook, and he had been afraid of the cold all his long life. But he stood at his place in the great hall, and he said, for the third and last and loudest time, the truth that turned the word thief inside out forever. He said plain that the figures in that great book were false, your grace, that he had known it a year, and I held my tongue for a winter's coal, while a good woman kept them honest and was called a thief for it. The cook never stole so much as a crust. The thief in this hall has been at the high table all along. Silence. The held breath of a full hall. The Duchess on her feet, now her clean ledger open to the lie, her bought witness turned against her, her built thief vindicated by the very book she had thought destroyed, and her niece, Lady Margaret, drawing slightly away from her along the bench, with the small involuntary recoil of a young woman who has just understood which side of a ruin she is sitting on. The Duke stood. And here he gave the calibrated thing, the single measured act, the moment required, and no more. He did not denounce the Duchess in a torrent. He did not call for her arrest before her own parish at her own feast. He closed the clean ledger, and he held up the small, worn receipt book where all the hall could see it. And he said one short sentence into the silence, the sentence that named the truth and claimed the woman who had kept it. 12 words plain, spoken in the same hall where the verdict thief had been pronounced. This honest book and the woman who kept it are no thief. That was all. He let it stand in the silence. Then, into the held quiet, he did the second small calibrated thing. He stepped down from the high table the length of the hall, past the gentry and the staring poor, to the lower door where a woman in a thin cloak had come in unseen at the back of the company, because she had asked to be there when the truth was read and he had not been able to refuse her, and he offered her his hand before the entire parish. The dismissed cook, the named thief, and led her up to stand beside him at the trustees' table in the full sight of every soul who had heard her called a thief at the noon bell a week before, a name claimed, a hand offered. The verdict reversed in the very arena that had pronounced it. He said nothing more grand than that. He did not need to. The hand he had crossed a whole hall to offer said all of it. The Duchess did not fall in a heap, and there was no triumph to be taken in her fall. She was a confidently wrong woman whose script had worked in every drawing room in England and stopped working only here, in a hall full of the poor she had robbed, against a cook who had kept a truer book than her own. She stood at the head of her board with her paste necklace and her forged ledger, and saw, in one cold moment, that there was no card left to play. The charity would pass out of her hand to the trustees now, and the law would have the burned ledger explained to it in due and quiet course. She was not dragged from her hall. She was, in the older and harder sense, simply finished, displaced from the one power she had stolen, corrected before the parish she had thought beneath her notice. In the moment before she gathered her claret skirts and left her own feast in the silence, she looked, just once, at the small worn book on the table, and her face did a thing it had never done in 20 years of famous composure. It showed that she understood, at last, that she had been beaten, not by rank and not by luck, but by a kitchen woman's 2 years of patient, honest arithmetic, and that the understanding shamed her more than any sentence the law could pass. Tranter. The steward did not wait for the law. He was gone from the county by the week's end. Lady Margaret Raden went home to her own people, and there is no cruelty owed her in this telling, for she had been only a girl told all her life she was the right choice, and she had drawn back from the ruin in time and learned, perhaps, to read a person's worth by a truer book than her aunt had taught her. The almswomen had their physic that winter and their proper coal, and old widow Sallow had a stone above her at last, with the charity's name upon it, bought from the £19 restored. Old Calbeck kept his cottage warm and unafraid for the rest of his short life, and said often to anyone who would hear that he had told the truth at the end, and that it was the best day's work of his 80 years. and Prudence Faircloth did not go to Bristol. The matter of the charity took the spring to settle, and through that spring she lived at Edrington under the housekeeper's care, and the Duke found again and again that the business of the trust required him to consult the only person who understood its true accounts. Which is to say, he found a great many reasons to sit in a room with a woman who kept an honest book. He was not a man who declared himself easily. The grief he carried had taught him caution, and his rank had taught him a stillness that looked, to those who did not know him, like cold. Prudence had learned to read that stillness by then. She had learned that come inside meant you are precious to me, and eat something meant I cannot bear to see you want, and the level voice that gave commands was the careful wall a man builds around a heart that has once failed to save someone and means never to fail again. He asked her, in the May of that year, in the library where she had first laid her book open in the candlelight, whether she would stay, not as a cook. He said it plainly, in the short, level way that was his, that he had spent his life unable to forgive himself one cold death in a charity house, and that she had spent 2 years keeping the bread true for women she would never be thanked by, and that he had never in his life met another soul who understood, in their very bones, that the small honest shillings are where a person's whole worth is written. He said that he did not want to administer the Almesbury charity without her, and then, because that was not the whole of it, and he was an honest man, even when honesty cost him his composure, he said that he did not want to do anything at all without her, and that he was asking her, as plainly as he knew how, to be his wife. She said yes by setting her hand in his. The same hand he had offered her the length of the hall, raw, no longer, and steady. They were married in the parish church below the almshouse wall, in the quiet of a Tuesday with no grand company, the almswomen of the row in their best shawls in the front pews because Prudence would have it so, and old Calbeck giving her hand, his own no longer shaking, into the Duke's. There was no famous season in it, and no claret gown, and no paste stone winking at a high table. There was bread at the church door. For the parish, true bread, weighed true. And the small, honest sum it cost, entered fair, in a book that no one would ever again need to keep a secret copy of. I will not keep you much longer, and I thank you for staying with Prudence until the end of her cold road. For she walked a good part of it believing no one would ever believe her, and it matters that someone did. On a warm evening, late in that first summer, the new Duchess of Marenby, who had once been a cook, turned out of doors as a thief, sat by the open library window at Edrington, with the receipt book in her lap, the little worn book. She had kept it, though there was no longer any earthly need. Nicholas found her there with it, and did not ask why she kept it, because he understood. She turned the pages of her own plain hand, 2 years of true figures copied small beneath the spice papers of a kitchen that had called her a thief, the only honest column in the county on a cold January morning, and she closed it and set it on the sill in the last of the light, and she let her hand rest on the worn cover a moment longer than she needed to. Below the window the water meadows were green, and the bread had gone out true at the church door that quarter, and would go out true at the next. She did not put the book away in a drawer. She left it there on the sill in the warm dusk, within reach the way you leave a thing that saved you, where you can lay your hand on it. And she turned to the window, and the evening came on quiet and warm over the meadows. She had crossed once in the ice, and she was at the last, and for the rest of her long life believed